Welcome everyone to the Great Lakes Permaculture Design Collaborative.
We are a trio of permaculturists.
Rhonda Baird from Bloomington, Indiana.
William Faith from Chicago, Illinois.
Milton Dixon from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
We're teaming up to create a hands-on learning experience
that can catapult you into a regenerative practice of your own.
glpdc.info
will send you to the host of our next Permaculture Design Certificate course.
So, hi, I'm William Faith, and I'm here with my colleagues Milton Dixon.
Hi.
And Rhonda Baird.
Hello.
And we're here looking at our permaculture flower today. We're going to talk about animals. And this one, I would say, tends to fall in land and nature's stewardship for the most part. And as we move on into our first slide, this is an example of how broken our food system actually is. The picture on the left is an example of battery cage hens and the more common way that they're produced. And the picture on the right is what we would call more of a permaculture system where you have free-ranging hens. And the question I always like to ask here is, where would you rather be?
I know the answer to that one for me.
I know, me too.
And so this is always an interesting topic because we have different approaches. I, myself, tend to approach permaculture from a vegan perspective.
We do, and I tend to be all over the place as an omnivore.
I personally kind of stick with the Weston A. Price methodology.
And so this is really always a rich topic because there's a lot of different perspectives, but they all fall under the rubric of permaculture, and that's where it gets really valuable. So people will always ask, do I have to have animals in a system for it to be a permaculture system? And the answer is no, not necessarily. You don't have to keep animals, but animals are always a part of a system. And in a vegan permaculture way of looking at it, we tend to plant and design to invite animals and wildlife into a system.
You know, I think this picture on the left, we all agree, is pretty horrific. And it's because we, again, apply that monoculture approach, which nature never does, that it creates so much ill health and waste. So, whereas the picture on the right, it's a more integrated system, it's more in balance. It's obvious that there's a relationship going on between the animals and their environment, which allows them to be healthier.
Absolutely.
I would also point out the parallels between the picture on the left and the human experience in the city.
Sure.
It kind of mirrors the way that we take care of ourselves, the way that we organize our lives. Very confined, we live in very dense areas. It's kind of that ugly when you really think about it.
Even if you look at the transportation involved, it's not that dissimilar to our own situation. And so, yeah, that is a great distinction to make and a good parallel. It's there's really no question that I'd rather be a chicken on the right.
Mm-hmm.
So as we move to our next slide, what we look to do in permaculture is really design to integrate plants and animals as much as possible. An example of this on the left is just planting plants that will bring insects in to do our pollination, like the bee pollinating the echinacea flower there, to even on the right where you've got worms turning waste into worm castings and good compost.
Yeah, animals, one of their main functions in any system is to enhance fertility, whether that's through pollination or through working the soils. And I've heard it over and over again with people who adopt permaculture or farming systems. They'll often say, if they're doing intensive gardening, that they're really farming for the worms and everything else is a benefit because they're so valuable in the system.
They really are the movers of resources in a way that plants can't.
Definitely.
So moving them from where there's more to where there's less. It's a huge source of fertility.
One more thing on the worms. Everybody complains about invasive plants, but earthworms aren't native to this continent, and yet no one really complains about the fact that there are earthworms. They really see them as the benefit that they are. So I think they're one of those species that really help us break that sort of lockdown mindset.
Definitely. And so as we discuss animal systems, we move on into the broad topic of agroforestry, and which has many different expressions. One here is that we're looking at is alley cropping, which is kind of loosely defined as a single row of trees with largely annual crops in between. And the trees will provide windbreak, which will allow annual crops to establish, and then smaller animals can be led into range.
And it's nice because when you let those animals in, especially if you have leguminous trees that you're using, you're growing, it's not just forage from whatever crop residue is left, but fodder that's there for the animals as well.
Yep.
And looking at this system, really looks like that it's perhaps not as integrated to the extent that a permaculture system might be. But as a farmer, you're always trying to balance productivity and ease of harvest and maintenance with the benefits that this sort of thing can provide. And even in this instance, just a row of corn between a couple rows of trees can make a big difference.
Sure. And then our next slide is more of an example of what we would call silvopasture. A little bit similar in that there's animals and trees involved, but in this case, it's more of a forested system, and animals can graze and browse on the grasses that are under the trees, or from the trees and bushes themselves, if in the case you've planted fodder for them. And all of the trees will provide shade and shelter, while the animals are providing nutrient fertility.
There are always cautions about what tree species you use, with particularly goats and cattle. And sort of the classic example in this situation is that you don't put them under cherries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So knowing and researching is part of our job.
Absolutely. So this slide's an example of rotational grazing, which is where you partition off different parts of the pasture to allow cows, sheep, and goats to graze on a certain segment, while the other area has a chance to regenerate in between.
And part of the reason for doing that is that if you allow the animals access to the entire area, they'll just pick what are called the ice cream plants, which degrades the pasture over time. Whereas when you put them in a mob situation, they're hungry, so they're going to eat everything available. So that's a better pasture management strategy long term when they do that. Plus they're adding their manures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This is really mimicking, one example would be herds of bison in the plains. Some of the similarities that they move through once and don't come back again for perhaps a whole year or more.
Mm-hmm. I'll just say one more thing about this kind of pasture management is that when you mob graze and you have planted in certain species, what you find is that because they're eating everything and they're managing everything, you can actually increase the diversity of plants that the animals, cattle in this case, are eating. And so they actually are getting more nutrition from the pasture as well because they are eating a wider variety of better managed pasture. So they're healthier.
And then on to our next slide, it's always important to consider the roles and habitats of small and large livestock in any system. Different animals have different behaviors. For example, chickens tend to cultivate and scratch up areas, which is fantastic for preparing an area for planting. They also leave a lot of fertility behind in the form of manure. Whereas ducks are fantastic to let in. They'll eat a lot of your slugs. They'll do a lot of your weeding for you. And then on the lower left, we see pigs, which are fantastic for really digging up and cultivating tough soils and getting into more difficult areas. Sheep and goats, which will clear an area in a remarkable amount of time if kept together. And then cows, which will, as we were just mentioning, will give you a lot of fertility and clear an area for you over a period of time.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to know where the different animals come from, where they originated, and the kind of things that they like, so that you can help make them more comfortable and understand the kind of work they can do for you. So chickens are originally jungle fowl from Southeast Asia. They like a forested environment. They like some cover. Pigs are from marshy, wooded areas, so that's where they're most comfortable. And they'll recreate that wherever they are. Goats, drier areas, and they like to browse head up on shrubs, whereas sheep head down and they like grass. So we can consider that when we are designing for them.
Indeed. And then we get into general husbandry and care, and this is an area of some distinction between conventional permaculture versus vegan permaculture systems, but all these same considerations apply. In the upper left, there's basic food. How are you feeding your animals? Do you have fodder for them? Do you have pasture for them? What are you doing in the colder months? These are all considerations. Getting to hygiene, which the picture in the center there is me washing one of our old pigs, Wilbert, at a farmed animal sanctuary that I used to be a part of. And on the right, healthcare. That's me looking after a veal calf named Gandhi, who is on an IV drip there, trying to bring him back to health. And protection, as Rhonda was just saying, looking after some of the natural habitat and considerations with the different animals that we bring in. Chickens, they love to perch, they love to roost. So providing them area to do that is key. And then when we get into reproduction or control of reproduction, if that's a concern, not putting your roosters with your hens needlessly, taking that into consideration in your design is essential as well.
Just thinking about characteristics, if you're going to bring an animal or species on, what do you know about where they come from? Do you get them from a farmer or a breeder who does a lot of best practices and then continue that on your own farm? So that's the kind of thing I'm always concerned about when people bring in animals, is that they do that kind of care for the animal.
Sure, know your source.
Know your source, yeah. And then you can usually use that connection and that investigation to find things like, are these animals, do they have characteristics that allow them to be easier to care for, or do they match your system better?
Which is a perfect segue to our next slide.
Excellent.
The gold standard of any permaculture presentation, the permaculture chicken. You've doubtless heard us mention inputs and outputs to a great extent so far, and this is a great example. If we're looking at the needs and the products, in this case of a chicken, this is where you kind of break that down. And on the left, you'll see that the basic needs are shelter, grit, dust, water, etc. And then the products of it are, as we were mentioning in some previous ones, manure, scratching, foraging, and the rest.
I've mentioned this before. I really love what's called a needs and yields analysis for design because it helps us make connections and be creative. It spurs inspiration for how we can make our designs better. When we think about how to match each of those needs up with a yield of something else, or the yields from this species with the needs of another, either species or aspect of the design. It's really valuable practice.
Each of these needs, if not met, kind of lead to deficits or not allow the animal to be who it is. That's in my mind the goal. And then on the other side of the coin, then there's all these products and behaviors, any one of which can be pollution if it's taken on its own, but if put in the right place can be really a useful thing and can feed into the next aspect of another system.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Right.
And then for our last slide, this is what we like to think of as a perfect integration of all these aspects. When things are working well together, you get that extra yield, which is beauty. And this is just a great example of proper land management where water, animals, plants, soils are all integrated into one design really effectively.
Yeah, sometimes I like to point out that when we're doing this really well, we're meeting our needs and the needs of everything in the system in a very small area, which allows us to shrink our footprint, essentially. And that allows space, literally land, for other species that aren't involved in our domestic systems at all. And that takes us into that larger conversation about landscape restoration, ecological restoration, and cohabitating the planet with other species.
And we're on to our last slide here. And so once again, this falls largely under land and nature stewardship, and this hopefully has demonstrated to you the role that animals play in a permaculture system.